I bought Blackwood Manor for a price so low it should have been a death sentence. It was a sprawling Victorian relic, a labyrinth of dark mahogany and stained glass, draped in ivy that looked less like garden decor and more like choking, opportunistic veins. When the realtor handed me the heavy brass keys, his skin was clammy, his hands shaking so violently that the metal chimed like a funeral bell. He wouldn't step over the threshold. He stood on the gravel driveway, his eyes darting toward the darkened attic windows as if he expected something to be staring back. "The structure is sound, Mark," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "But houses like this, they have memories that don't like to be disturbed. Just a word of advice, don't let the furnace go out. Keep the heat above 22 degrees Celsius at all times, and whatever you do, no matter how much the damp bothers you, do not peel the wallpaper in the master bedroom." I laughed, chalking his nerves up to a flair for the dramatic and a desperate need to close a sale on a haunted property. I was a man of cold logic, a structural engineer who dealt in load-bearing beams and blueprints, looking for a massive renovation project to drown out the suffocating silence of my recent divorce. I wanted to tear this place apart and rebuild it into something modern. But the moment I stepped over the threshold and the heavy oak door groaned shut behind me, the air changed. It didn't just feel cold, it felt dense, like I was walking through invisible wet curtains of cobwebs. The scent hit me a moment later, a cloying, metallic tang, like old copper coins soaked in rotting lilies. I stood in the grand foyer, my footsteps echoing through the hollow ribs of the house, and for the first time in my life, I felt the distinct, prickling sensation of being watched by the walls themselves. The house wasn't empty, it was waiting. By the third night, the logic I prided myself on was starting to fray at the edges. The temperature in the master bedroom refused to stay above 16 degrees Celsius, despite the furnace downstairs roaring like a caged beast. The air in that room felt different, thicker, more humid, and carrying a faint, rhythmic pulsing that I could feel in the soles of my feet. I blamed the old plumbing, but the wallpaper, that hideous mustard yellow floral pattern from the 1920s, was beginning to blister and weep a translucent, amber-colored sap. I remembered the realtor's trembling warning, "Do not peel the wallpaper." But as a structural engineer, all I saw was a moisture problem that would lead to rot. I grabbed a putty knife and a spray bottle of stripping solution, determined to see the bones of the room. I started at the corner near the ceiling, where the paper was already curling like scorched skin. As I slid the blade underneath, I expected the dry crunch of old paste. Instead, there was a wet, squelching sound, like a surgical incision. A wave of that metallic, coppery scent hit me so hard I nearly gagged. I peeled back a 3-foot strip, and my breath hitched in my throat. The wall behind the paper wasn't made of lath and plaster. It was a pale, ivory-colored surface, slightly warm to the touch and crisscrossed with a network of blue and purple wires. I leaned in closer, my heart hammering against my ribs, and realized they weren't wires at all. They were veins. And as I watched, horrified, a pulse throbbed through the wall. The house wasn't built of timber and stone. The studs were long, calcified bones, and the walls were stretched, cured skin. I wasn't renovating a house. I was standing inside the thoracic cavity of something that was still breathing. The discovery in the bedroom sent me stumbling back, my boots slipping on the amber-colored sap that was now oozing from the wall like a slow, sticky wound. I didn't stay to watch it heal. I ran for the kitchen, my mind screaming that this was some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by mold or chemical fumes from the old pipes. I needed water. I needed a phone that actually had a signal in this dead zone. But as I burst into the kitchen, the temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted. The air turned into a wall of frost that burned my lungs. I looked at the digital thermometer I'd mounted on the wall. 4 degrees Celsius. The furnace had failed. I remembered the realtor's panicked eyes. "Don't let the heat drop." I scrambled toward the basement door, but as I passed the central kitchen island, I saw it, a small, rectangular brass slot built directly into the hardwood floor. It looked like a vintage mail chute, but it didn't lead outside. It opened into the black void between the floorboards. A sound began to rise from that slot, a wet, whistling wheeze like a massive pair of punctured lungs trying to draw breath. Then, a hand, if you could call it that, slid out of the brass opening. It was nearly 2 feet long, gray as wood ash, with 4 extra knuckles on every finger. It didn't have nails. It had translucent, hooked talons that clicked against the floorboards. I watched, paralyzed, as the hand blindly swept the floor, its fingers elongated and twitching with a horrific spider-like intelligence. It grabbed a heavy wooden cutting board I'd left on the counter and dragged it down into the slot with a violent, splintering crack. Then the voice came, not from the slot, but from the very walls around me. It was a vibration that rattled my teeth. "Cold," the house groaned. "The fire is out. Feed the hearth, or the hearth feeds on you." I realized then that the furnace wasn't heating the house for my comfort. It was a distraction for the thing that lived in the foundations. The basement door didn't just open. It exhaled. A gust of stagnant graveyard air hit me, thick with the smell of wet coal and something sweet like rotting fruit. I descended the wooden stairs, each step screaming under my weight as if the wood itself were in pain. At the bottom, the darkness wasn't absolute. The room was bathed in a rhythmic, pulsing violet glow emanating from the belly of the massive iron furnace. This wasn't a standard boiler. It was a Victorian monstrosity of soot-stained steel, shaped less like a machine and more like a crouching, bloated torso. The pilot light wasn't blue or orange. It was a flickering, sickly purple flame that cast long, distorted shadows against the foundation stones. And there, piled neatly in the corner of the violet light, was the sight that finally broke my logical mind. Hundreds of shoes. They weren't adult work boots or discarded sneakers. They were tiny, leather-soled shoes from the turn of the century. Mary Janes with rusted buckles, lace-up boots with the toes worn through, and silk slippers that had turned gray with age. They were arranged in a perfect, terrifying circle around the furnace. As I stepped closer, my flashlight beam caught something glinting inside the furnace's ash pit. I reached out with a trembling hand and pulled out a small, charred brass tag. Property of St. Jude's Home for the Lost, 1922. Suddenly, the violet flame flared, roaring with a sound that mimicked a choir of screaming children. The veins in the basement ceiling, those blue and purple wires I'd seen upstairs, began to thrash and leak. The house wasn't just built of bone and skin, it was fueled by something far more precious. I realized with a jolt of pure horror that the consulting fee the realtor had mentioned wasn't about maintenance. The furnace didn't just need heat, it needed a heartbeat. And as the heavy iron door of the basement slammed shut, locking me in with the purple fire, the shoes on the floor began to tap dance in unison. The tapping didn't stop. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical vibration that traveled up through the soles of my boots and settled deep in my marrow. Hundreds of tiny, hollow heels clicked against the concrete floor in a frantic, syncopated rhythm. In the pulsing violet light of the furnace, the shoes seemed to move on their own, dancing in a circle that was slowly, inexorably tightening around me. "Stop it!" I screamed, the sound of my own voice sounding thin and alien in the vast, damp cellar. The tapping ceased instantly. The silence that followed was worse, a heavy, expectant pressure that made my ears pop. I looked up, searching for a way out, and that's when my flashlight beam hit the ceiling joists. I had assumed the pipes I saw earlier were just an odd architectural choice, But in the basement, the truth was stripped bare. The main support beam of the house wasn't made of steel or oak. It was a massive calcified column of human spines fused together with a dark, glistening resin. Rib cages arced outward to form the secondary joists, their bleached white surfaces etched with the same frantic, scratched names I had seen on the lead-lined walls. But these weren't just bones. They were moaning. A low, guttural hum vibrated from the ceiling, the collective groan of 100 souls crushed under the weight of the Victorian brickwork above. As the temperature continued to drop, the resin began to crack, and a thick black fluid, cold as ice and smelling of ancient seawater, started to drip onto my shoulders. "The weight," a voice rasped, appearing to come from the very marrow of the spinal beam. "It's so heavy, Mark. Won't you help us hold it up?" The floor beneath me began to soften, turning from solid concrete into a porous, sponge-like membrane. My boots started to sink. The house wasn't just hungry for heat anymore. It was looking for a new pillar to replace the one that was cracking. I realized then that the shoes weren't just trophies. They were the only parts of the children that the house couldn't digest. I felt my shins disappearing into the floor, the porous concrete tightening around my legs like cooling wax. Desperate, I swung my crowbar at the nearest support beam, the one made of fused, ivory-colored spines. The impact didn't sound like metal on bone. It sounded like a wet thud against a living lung. The entire house shivered, a low, subsonic moan vibrating through the floorboards that nearly knocked me unconscious. The floor spat me out. The sudden upward surge of the membrane threw me against a heavy oak-paneled door I hadn't noticed before, a utility closet tucked behind the throbbing furnace. I scrambled inside and slammed the door, fumbling for the light switch. The light didn't flicker. It hummed with a sickly, organic yellow glow. The walls of this closet weren't skin or bone. They were covered in thousands of yellowed, translucent blueprints pinned to the wood with rusted surgical needles. I leaned in, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and realized these weren't architectural drawings. They were anatomical diagrams. The Blackwood Manor wasn't a house. It was a biological machine. In the center of the wall was a master plan labeled the Lazarus Vessel, 1892. The signature at the bottom made my blood turn to slush. Architect Elias Blackwood. Beneath the name was a terrifying realization. The dates weren't for his life, they were for his construction. Foundation laid in bone, insulation woven in hair, circulation fueled by the innocent. I shall not die, I shall merely become the roof over your heads. A small leather-bound journal sat on a shelf, its pages made of something that felt suspiciously like vellum. I opened it to the last page, dated only yesterday. The ink was still wet, a dark crimson red. The engineer has arrived. His bones are dense, his grief is deep. He will make a fine central pillar. The house is cold, and he is so very warm. Suddenly, the walls of the closet began to contract. The blueprints started to ripple, the needles popping out one by one as the room began to breathe in, a deep, rhythmic inhalation that pulled the very air from my lungs. Elias Blackwood wasn't a ghost haunting the house. He was the house, and I was standing inside his throat. The walls of the utility closet weren't just contracting, they were undulating. The wood paneling softened into a slick, muscular tissue that began to ripple with a rhythmic, downward motion. My heavy steel crowbar, leaning against the corner, was suddenly gripped by the wall as if the wood had turned into 1,000 tiny, suction-cupped tongues. I watched in horror as the solid metal was slowly pulled into the wall, the surface sealing over it like a healing scar. "No!" I lunged for the door handle, but the brass knob had dissolved into a sticky, cartilaginous nub that wouldn't turn. The room was swallowing me. Every time the house exhaled, the closet shrank, the blueprints crinkling like dry skin as they were absorbed into the fleshy substrate. I could feel the heat now, not the dry heat of a furnace, but the humid, oppressive warmth of a living throat. The air was becoming a soup of acidic vapors that stung my eyes and turned my clothes into damp rags. Desperate, I kicked at the back wall of the closet, right where the Lazarus vessel blueprint had been. The tissue tore with a sound like wet canvas, and instead of brick or mortar, I saw a cavity filled with a rhythmic, glowing light. I crawled through the tear, falling into a hollow space behind the furnace that didn't appear on any floor plan. Here, the veins from the rest of the house converged into a single, massive knot of translucent tubes. In the center of this web hung the heart of Blackwood Manor. It was the size of a small car, a mottled gray-blue organ suspended by thick, pulsing tendons. It didn't beat like a human heart, it shuddered, a deep, sub-bass thrum that shook the very foundations of the earth. And as I looked closer at the translucent surface of the organ, I saw faces. Dozens of faces, pressed against the inner membrane like swimmers trapped under ice. Their mouths were open in a silent, eternal scream, and their eyes, wide and milky, turned in unison to look at me. Among them was the realtor. His face was fresh, his mouth still forming the word "run" as the heart's internal fluids dragged him deeper into the valve. The house wasn't just built of bones, it was a living museum of everyone who had ever signed the deed. The hum of the heart was so deep I could feel my teeth vibrating in their sockets. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical weight, a gravitational pull that drew the air right out of my lungs. Every time the massive organ shuddered, the violet light from the furnace flared, casting long, jagged shadows of the trapped faces against the damp stone walls. I realized then that the furnace wasn't burning fuel, it was burning essence. I looked back at the iron door of the boiler. It wasn't a firebox anymore, it was a gaping, toothless maw. The violet flames didn't emit heat in the traditional sense, they emitted nostalgia. As I stood near the opening, I felt a sudden sharp pang of my wedding day, the smell of my ex-wife's perfume, the taste of the champagne, the sound of her laughter. It was so vivid I could almost reach out and touch it. But as the memory intensified, the flame grew brighter, and I felt a terrifying hollowness opening up in my chest. The house wasn't just warming the air, it was stripping my mind. "The fire is hungry," the walls whispered, the voice now a 1,000-part harmony of the faces trapped in the heart. "Feed it a memory, Mark. Give us the day you bought your first car. Give us the name of your first dog. Give us the warmth of your mother's hand, and the house will let you breathe for one more hour." I watched as a small glowing wisp of light, a literal fragment of my childhood, was sucked out of my forehead and into the violet vortex. The temperature in the room ticked up by a single degree. The shivering in my limbs stopped, replaced by a numbing, blissful fog. I was forgetting the color of my mother's eyes, but I was finally warm. I looked at the nursery of shoes near the furnace. They weren't just trophies of the dead, they were the husks left behind once the house had finished eating every memory, every dream, and every thought those children ever had. I was standing in a soul processor, and I was the next delivery.
The fog in my mind was seductive. It would have been so easy to let the house take it all. The birthdays, the summer vacations, the smell of rain on hot asphalt. But as the violet flame reached out like a flickering tongue to lick the edges of my consciousness, I felt a spark of cold, jagged defiance. If this house wanted to eat, I would give it a feast it couldn't digest. I stepped closer to the iron maw, the heat searing the hair on my arms. "You want my memories?" I spat, my voice cracking in the humid air. "Then take the ones I've been trying to kill for years." I didn't offer up the warmth of my mother's kitchen. Instead, I forced myself to relive the darkest, most corrosive moments of my life. I fed the furnace the memory of the cold, sterile hospital room where my father took his last ragged breath while I stood paralyzed by a silence I couldn't break. I threw in the moment my ex-wife looked at me with total, hollow indifference and told me she'd never loved the man I'd become. I summoned every ounce of shame, every failure, and every bitter drop of resentment I had ever carried. The reaction was instantaneous. The violet flame didn't brighten, it turned a sickly, bruised black-green. The heart of Blackwood Manor gave a violent, wet shudder that nearly knocked me into the ash pit. The faces inside the membrane began to contort, their silent screams turning into audible, guttural retching. The veins in the ceiling turned gray and began to shrivel, hissing like punctured steam pipes. I was poisoning the engine. The house lived on the warmth of life, the sweet energy of hope and childhood. My concentrated trauma was like acid in its veins. The grand staircase upstairs groaned as if its spinal support were snapping, and the amber sap weeping from the walls turned into a thin, black bile. The house was trying to vomit me out, but the basement door remained fused shut, a reflex of a dying predator that refuses to let go of its meal even as it chokes. The black-green flames roared, fueled by the bitter acid of my own failures. The basement didn't just shake, it convulsed. A sound like 1,000 wet sheets tearing echoed from the floorboards above, and for a moment I thought the entire Victorian structure would collapse into the earth. But then, the shadows in the corner of the boiler room, the ones that shouldn't have been there, the ones that didn't move with the flickering fire, began to knit themselves together. A figure stepped out of the darkness behind the furnace. He was impossibly tall, his limbs elongated and spindly, draped in a tattered frock coat that seemed to be made of the same leathery wallpaper I had tried to strip upstairs. His face was a horrifying map of architectural precision. His skin was stretched so tight over his skull that it looked like vellum, and his eyes were nothing more than two dark, hollow inkwells. He didn't walk, he glided, his feet making the same clicking sound as the children's shoes. "You are a very bitter vintage, Mark," the architect rasped. His voice didn't come from a throat, it vibrated out of the stone walls around me. "I sought a pillar, not a poison. Most men cling to their joy. You embrace your rot." He raised a hand with too many knuckles, just like the one that had slid through the floor slot, and the black-green flames died instantly. The temperature plummeted to a bone-snapping cold. The architect leaned in, the scent of copper and lilies so thick I could taste it on my tongue. "If you will not be the warmth that sustains the house," he whispered, his hollow eyes boring into mine, "then you shall be the foundation that suffers for it. I have plenty of room in the sub-basement for a soul that refuses to burn." The floor beneath me didn't just soften this time, it dissolved. I felt the concrete turn into a viscous, freezing liquid that pulled at my waist, my chest, my throat. I was being dragged down into the gut of the manor, where the light of the furnace couldn't reach, and where the architect kept the things that were too broken to digest. I didn't fall. I was swallowed. The concrete floor didn't break, it rippled like a dark, gelatinous throat, pulling me down into a space that shouldn't have existed. The air here was different. It wasn't just cold, it was stagnant, a pressurized silence that made my eardrums throb. I landed on a mound of something soft and shifting. When I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cut through a fog so thick it looked like gray wool. I wasn't on dirt. I was standing on a mountain of discarded clothes, faded denim, polyester suits, and rotting flannel shirts.
thousands of lives stripped of their memories and dumped here like garbage. "Don't shine that light too high," a voice rasped from the gloom. It sounded like two rusted gears grinding together. "The ceiling down here, it likes to reach back." I whirled around, my light catching a figure sitting on a crate of old mason jars. He looked like a man, or what was left of one. He wore a tattered corduroy jacket from the 70s, but his skin had taken on the exact gray, porous texture of the foundation stones. His fingers were fused to the crate, and his eyes were milky, overgrown with a thin, translucent film. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "I was the Mark of 1974, he said, a horrific, lopsided smile stretching his stone-like face. "I thought I could fix the plumbing. I thought I could outsmart the architect. But the house doesn't just eat your joy, boy. It eats your time. I've been sitting here for 50 years, and to the house, I'm nothing but a kidney stone it hasn't passed yet." He pointed a stiff, stony finger toward the far wall, where a massive, rusted iron pipe, thick as a redwood tree, pulsed with a dark, rhythmic sludge. "That's the main artery. It carries the waste, the trauma you fed the furnace, straight to the roots. You didn't kill the house, Mark. You just gave it antacid. And now, the architect is going to use you as the antacid." The stone man from 1974 didn't blink. His eyes were fixed on the pulsing, iron-thick artery, a look of hollow envy on his gray features. "He's coming for the rest of me soon," he whispered, his voice like gravel grinding in a barrel. "The house is cramping from your memories, Mark. It needs to flush the system. It needs to turn us both into the grout that fills the cracks you made." I looked at the massive pipe. It wasn't just metal. It was covered in a sweating, translucent membrane that throbbed with every agonized beat of the heart above. The waste, the black, acidic trauma I had fed the furnace, was churning inside it, seeking a way out. I could see the pipe bulging, the iron groaning under a pressure it was never meant to contain. "If I rupture that," I said, my voice steadying with a desperate realization, "the whole foundation drowns in that acid. The house, it would dissolve from the inside." The stone man let out a dry, rattling wheeze, a laugh. "You can't break it. My hands are stone, and I couldn't even scratch the surface. You're just flesh. You'll be pulp before you dent the iron." I looked at his fused, calcified arm, a solid, jagged club of human bone and mineralized sediment. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a structural element, a biological sledgehammer. I grabbed his petrified shoulder, feeling the cold, unforgiving weight of 50 years of compression. "I'm not using my hands," I said, bracing my feet against the mound of rotting clothes. "I'm using yours." I began to heave, pulling his gray, anchored body toward the pulsing artery. The stone man screamed, a sound like a mountain cracking, as his fused joints snapped and splintered. But he didn't fight me. A spark of ancient, buried rage flared in his milky eyes. "Do it," he rasped, his stone fingers clawing at the air. "Break the cage, even if we burn in the bile." I swung his heavy, petrified torso like a battering ram. The first strike against the artery sounded like a bell tolling in a cathedral. The second cracked the iron. On the third, the stone man's arm shattered and the artery exploded. The explosion didn't sound like a pipe bursting. It sounded like a dying god's last breath. A thick, viscous jet of black bile, the concentrated essence of every nightmare I had fed the furnace, sprayed out with the force of a fire hose. It was freezing, colder than the sub-basement air, and it smelled of old hospital corridors and funeral incense. The stone man's petrified torso was swept away instantly, his gray face vanishing beneath the rising tide of ink. I scrambled up the mound of rotting clothes, my boots slipping on the slick, acidic sludge. The bile didn't just touch my skin, it seeped into my pores, forcing me to relive the very traumas I had used to poison the house. I felt the crushing weight of my father's death all over again, the sting of my divorce, the hollow ache of every failure, each one a physical blow as the liquid rose to my chest. "You think you can drown me?" a voice gurgled. I looked up. The architect was descending through the ceiling, his elongated limbs moving like a spider's through the black flood. He wasn't gliding anymore, he was struggling. The bile was melting his leathery frock coat, stripping the vellum skin from his skeletal frame. His hollow, inkwell eyes were leaking the same black fluid. The sub-basement was filling fast. I was treading water, or what passed for water, in a sea of my own misery. The only way out was upward, through the mouth the architect had used to enter. But as I reached for his spindly, rotting leg to pull myself up, his hand clamped around my throat. "If the house dies," he hissed, his face dissolving into a cluster of raw nerves and white bone, "you die in its stomach. We sink together into the earth, Mark, a foundation of two." The black bile reached my chin. I had one choice: surrender to the weight of my past or use the very bitterness that was drowning me to dissolve the hand around my neck. The architect's grip was like a vice of frozen iron. My vision began to swim with black spots that matched the rising bile. As my head went under, the liquid trauma didn't just burn my skin. It flooded my mind with a singular, agonizing image. The day I took off my wedding ring and realized the house I'd shared for a decade was just a hollow shell. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the one thing I hadn't been able to throw away, the gold band. It wasn't just metal, it was a concentrated anchor of all the love that had turned into the very poison now drowning us. "You want a foundation?" I wheezed, the black fluid filling my mouth. "Take the weight of a promise that failed." I didn't throw the ring at him. I shoved it directly into the open, weeping wound in the architect's chest, the spot where the house's heart pulsed through his own ribs. The reaction was like dropping a spark into a powder keg. Gold, the symbol of a life lived for someone else, hit the black bile of my resentment. The architect's hollow eyes flared with a blinding, white-hot light. A scream tore through the house, not a human scream, but the sound of 1,000-ton beams snapping and glass shattering in every room above. The ring didn't just sink, it expanded, its golden light cauterizing the black rot. The architect's grip loosened as his body began to crystallize, turning into the very same brittle stone as the man from 1974. "No!" he howled, his face fracturing like an old mirror. "The cycle! The structure! It must stand!" "Let it fall!" I snarled. The pressure of the erupting artery finally reached its limit. The floor above us, the entire kitchen, and the feeding slot imploded. A whirlpool of debris, light, and violet fire dragged the architect down into the abyss of his own creation. I grabbed a dangling spinal joist, pulling myself upward as the sub-basement vanished into a liquid memory and stone. The ascent was a blur of splintering bone and suffocating dust. I climbed through the collapsing ribcage of the house, my fingers raw and bleeding as I hauled myself up the jagged remains of the spinal support beam. Behind me, the sub-basement groaned one final time, a wet, hollow thud as the architect, the stone man, and a century of stolen memories were swallowed by the earth. I burst through the floorboards of the foyer just as the grand mahogany staircase folded in on itself like a dying accordion. The veins in the walls were black and shriveled now, snapping like dry twigs. The cloying scent of copper and lilies was gone, replaced by the sharp ozone sting of a winter storm. I scrambled toward the front door, diving through the frame just as the heavy oak threshold was reclaimed by the sinking foundation. I tumbled onto the gravel driveway, gasping for air that didn't taste like decay. The sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon, casting a cold, pale light across the property. I turned back, expecting to see a smoking ruin, but there was only a void. Blackwood Manor hadn't just collapsed, it had vanished. Where the sprawling Victorian relic had stood, there was now only a perfectly rectangular scar in the earth, filled with churning black mud and the glint of a few tiny leather shoes. I looked down at my hands. They were stained with the black bile of the house, but as the morning dew touched my skin, the ink began to wash away. I felt lighter, dangerously light. The house had taken the weight of my divorce, the bitterness of my father's death, and the crushing guilt of my failures, and it had dragged them all down into the dark with it. The realtor's car was gone. The ivy on the surrounding trees had turned brown and brittle overnight. I reached into my pocket, half expecting to find the wedding ring, but it was gone too. The final consulting fee paid in full. I stood up, my joints popping in the cold air. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't heavy. It was just quiet. I walked toward the road, leaving the scar in the earth behind me. I didn't have a house, a marriage, or a single memory that didn't ache. But as I reached the gate, I realized the architect was wrong about one thing. A foundation doesn't have to be built of bone to be strong. Sometimes it's what's left when everything else has burned away.